Second. To pause this. Okay, thank you everybody for joining. Um, tonight, tonight's share is entitled 5.5 Purim Myths, mostly because I thought that was funny. And tonight or tomorrow, not tomorrow, is Taanit Esther. So I decided we would take a little break and continue with our and take a pause from our shiur on Tefillah. And a quick introduction is necessary. That is that when I say Purim Myths, this is not a class which is going to be hell-bent on debunking. This is not the point of this class. We're not looking to debunk or to dunk on any minhagim or people's impressions or ideas. When we discuss common misconceptions, it's better to approach things with nuance, to give everybody a clearer and deeper understanding of topics that they might have had misconceptions about before. I'm not here to dunk. I'm not here to debunk. Most of the time, I'll try to provide more information than they gave us in Cheder, and hopefully we'll come out all having learned something tonight. I'm not here to, of course. The whole point tonight is to learn something, to add nuance, to add to our knowledge of Purim. It's not here to dispel any myths or to debunk anybody's theories. So we're going to go through them one by one, and I want to go through common misconceptions that I think can that everybody can learn more about. The first that we're going to start with, and this is again not such a radical departure from Tefillah, is Taanit Esther. Taanit Esther, most people consider a standard fast. Like, okay, we have the 4 Taaniyot, and we have Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, and we have Taanit Esther. Many people think that it's a regular fast, just like any other fast. The truth is, Taanit Esther is, technically speaking, a minhag. The poskim, halachic deciders, actually call this a custom, a minhag. The Ramah says explicitly in Shulchan Aruch, "V'Taanit zu eno chova." It is not an obligation. And if it's not an obligation, where do we get it from? It's not in the Mishnah. It's not in the Gemara. The only place we find it is in the Geonim of Bavel, meaning the Rosh Yeshiva of Bavel in the 600s, 700s, 800s, 900s. They're the first people to discuss such a fast. And really, we don't even see anybody talk about it until the 800s. So the Geonim of Bavel from the 800s are the first people who talk about it. And in their time, they don't call it Taanit Esther mostly. They will call it Taanit Purim or Tzom al Megillah, meaning the fast of the Megillah. And in some sources, they call it Taanit Mordechai Esther. It is clear from the later sources that this was regarded as a minhag, but in the texts of the Geonim itself, it's not so clear what the Geonim thought of this fast or what they thought the history was of the fast. What's strange is that in the old text called Megillah Taanit, there's this old text that existed in the time of the Tanaim, where it was a table of days in which you cannot fast, and in that old table, the day 13th of Adar, Yud Gimel Adar, was not allowed to fast. It was called Yom Nikanor. It was a day in which the Maccabeim had a victory over General Nikanor, and because of this great victory, it was a day prohibited from fasting. So already in the time of the Yerushalmi Amoraim, they claim that in the 300s or 400s, they claim that we don't follow Megillah Taanit anymore. So Yud Gimel Adar, technically on the 13th of Adar, you would be allowed to fast. That means that whenever people stopped following Megillah Taanit, meaning roughly in the 300s, in between that time, when people thought it was usher to fast on the 13th of Adar, and sometime between then and the 800s is when this fast became a custom. Furthermore, we know that in Eretz Yisrael, they didn't have this minhag Bavli, this minhag of the Jews of Bavel. They didn't fast on Yud Gimel Adar. Rather, there were people in Eretz Yisrael who would fast Behab, meaning Monday, Thursday, Monday, before Purim. There were people who do Monday, Thursday, Monday after Purim. And they gave these reasons for it. Some said because, well, we don't want to interfere with Yom Nikanor. Some people said because we want to emulate the Taanit Esther. We want to emulate how Esther commanded people to do 3 days, and therefore we do Monday, Thursday, Monday. Whatever it is, there's been nothing but etiologies and explanations made after the fact and conjectures as to what and why Taanit Esther was instituted. There was I wouldn't call him a scholar, but a person named Mitchell First. He got his master's in history. He has a degree in law, who wrote a very exhaustive article on this, and he turned over every stone to find something conclusive about Taanit Esther, and he also came up empty-handed. Really, we have a bunch of different opinions in the Rishonim, but nobody really knows the history as to exactly when this custom began, or whether or not the early sages thought that this was something obligatory. Like, did they really think that this was something? So it seems that from some of the sources that even the Geonim thought it was obligatory, but we don't see that in any of the poskim. He believes that some of the Geonim even thought to read that into the Mishnah, and it's a complicated text, so we'll leave it for now. My point is that of all the fasts, and the point is the myth I want to clarify today is that Taanit Esther is not a standard fast, and if you're surprised that your rabbi is more makel by Taanit Esther, don't be surprised. Rabbis are a lot more lenient with nursing women and people who have very strenuous jobs and people who are sick. Rabbis are much, much more lenient with Taanit Esther, a Yom Milah, or a Chatan and his Sheva Barachot. All of these areas are fasts are exceptions for which rabbis will give for Taanit Esther. The main reason for not allowing people to break the fast is in Porshim Minat Tzibor. If the rest of the Tzibor is fasting, you should also fast. You shouldn't separate yourself from the Tzibor. That's the halachic construct of Taanit Esther. And I'll end with one interesting thing, and that is that none of the piyutim that were written for Purim were ever written for Taanit Esther. The only piyutim we have for Taanit Esther come from Bavel, because in Eretz Yisrael they didn't have Taanit Esther. So there's no Kalirian piyut or yotzer for Taanit Esther because they simply didn't have that. It's really an invention of the Bavliim. Okay, let's move on to one more. Number 2, women reading Megillah. Now, this one is a complicated issue. And the myth goes that there's no problem with women reading Megillah. Reading Megillah for women is completely fine. Women could have their own reading groups. Now, I'm not going to debunk that. Rather, let's elaborate, because saying that it's 100% fine is a bit misinformative. Rather, let's start with one simple truth, a clarity. It's just for clarity. And that is that in the past 3,000 years since the story of Purim, we have absolutely zero historical evidence of any woman reading Megillah B'tzibor. We don't have a text. We don't have a teshuvah. We don't have any literature. We don't have any attestations from Jews or non-Jews. Nowhere in the historical record do we have any record of a woman leading the tzibor by reading Megillah. That has to be said, and everybody agrees to that. We just don't have such a Mesorah. This is not the Mesorah of Klal Yisrael. This is not our tradition. As egalitarian as we might want to be, the truth is that history wasn't so kind to women, and women were much less often literate than men. And the simple reality is that women probably never read for men. However, the Rishonim discussed this academically with a lot of interest, because from an academic perspective, women can share and probably do share the same or almost the same chiyuv as men when it comes to reading Megillah. And if that's true that men and women share the same chiyuv, then a woman can read for other men, and women can definitely read for other women. So I'm not going to go into the complexities of the halacha. I'll give you a general background, and you can do your own research, and you could ask your own rabbi. But essentially, it's like this: the Mishnah in Megillah, Perek Bet Halacha Dalid, and the Bavli in Megillah, and the Bavli in Arachin, and the Yerushalmi in Megillah, all of those sources make it very clear that women are chayavot in Megillah just like men. And according to Rashi and the Arzarua and many Rishonim, these sources are making it clear that women can be motzi men. This is the position of many Rishonim. The Tosefta, let's start with that. The Tosefta in Megillah is an outlier. And the Megillah says that women are piturim. and they cannot be motzi men. Women are exempt, but they're patur from Megillah, and they cannot be motzi men. Complete contradiction to the Mishnah. So there's two positions. One position is of the Rishonim is that what's happening here is that the Tosefta is arguing on Bavli. The Tosefta is arguing on the Mishnah. And if that's the case, if the Tosefta is arguing, sorry, we're not paskening like this Tosefta. The Mishnah says women can read and women are chayavot. The Gemara says women can read and women are chayavot. And the Yerushalmi says it, and everybody says it. So we're not going to be machriya. We're not going to suddenly, what do you call it, defer to Tosefta. Tosefta is not halacha. This is how we paskin. But even though Rashi says this quite forcefully, doesn't sound like anybody actually did it. Rashi doesn't say, oh yeah, and my daughter is read for everybody. That's not what Rashi does. It just seems to be a halachic theoretical discussion. The other Rishonim, especially beginning with the Bahag, reconcile the Tosefta. And they say the Tosefta is really elaborating and explaining a lumdish distinction. The Tosefta is saying that what's actually happening is that women are not chayavot to read the Megillah. Women are only chayavot to hear the Megillah. And because women are only chayavot to hear, therefore their chiyuv is not equal to men. And therefore they cannot be motzi other men. And therefore, to skip the complexities, many different opinions emerged among the Rishonim and the Achronim as to how far we could technically go. Could you say women could only read for other women? Could you say women could read for other men? Could you say women could only read by night? Could you say women could only read, could count for minyan, cannot count for a minyan, could only read for a minyan of women, cannot read for a minyan of women? Okay, could only do it b'shat adchak. Is it kabod tzibur? And is it zila milta? Is it insulting to tzibur? Just like by kriyat Torah, we don't want a woman to read because it makes all the men look like they're illiterate. So too, it's disgraceful for a woman to read for the men because it looks like all the men are illiterate. Now, it's not until we get to the 20th century that this became a real discussion. Even at the end of the 20th century, there was a very controversial article published by Rabbi Avi Weiss in 1999, I believe, where he argued that women should be allowed to, and it's a good thing. Most likely, it's a good thing. He was very progressive about it. And then there was a rejoinder the next year. Somebody answered forcefully back that this is not the case. It's not our Messiah. And this is very testy in halachic waters. I would ask you, if you're really excited about this, to ask your own rabbi. I know with Sfaradim, there's more room to be makel. The Sfaradi poskim, some are actually more encouraging for it than others are. And the Ashkenazi poskim in general will more follow Ramah and the Yeshomer and Machaber, and the Ashkenazim are more machmer against it, generally speaking. Now, the one thing that interests me here, and that's just because I'm kind of nerdy, and what I do is study liturgy all day. For me, what interests me most about this sugya is that there's been an evolution recently. And in the past 25 years of this popularization, many of the women, the women-led Megillah readings have developed a custom, especially when they're in small home environments. They've developed this custom where women would take turns. One woman will read one section and another woman will read another section, and they bounce woman to woman. Now, halachically speaking, that's interesting. Let's put it that way. Most of the sources that speak about somebody taking over for Kriyat Torah or Megillah seem to be speaking about b'di'evet. Like, okay, if it happens, if the Chazan, gets sick, if the Chazan stops, if he doesn't know the rest, then somebody else could take over. They don't sound like they're talking about this lechatchila. But from a halachic construct perspective, there should be no reason why someone can't pick up and take over and do the rest of the Megillah. So that what happens is that you completely change the character of the ritual. The ritual of Kriyat Megillah has always been one of proclamation, where somebody is standing up and he is reading like the letter of the king or the letter of Mordechai to everybody. Everyone's silent and they listen as if it's a proclamation of the king. But when you change it to everybody taking turns and this woman or this man will do the funny part and this man will do the other part, it completely changes the character of the ritual. It takes Megillah reading and turns it into Haggadah Shel Pesach. So it's still a Persume Nisa, but you have everybody involved, and it turns it into more of a storytelling than it does a proclamation. And it changes completely the character of the liturgy and the character of the ritual. And I personally find that fascinating, how in such a short time you could find this evolution of the liturgy where it changes the character and it changes how it feels to people and how it looks to people entirely. I was speaking to one of the Talmidei Chacham in my yeshiva today, and he told me that he was listening to recording of the Toldos Avram Yitzchak Rebbe. The Toldos Avram Yitzchak Rebbe, in his Megillah reading, he reads himself, but then he only reads until the Aseres B'nai Haman. And at the end, by V'es, at the last part of the Aseres B'nai Haman, his son takes over, and his son reads the rest of the Megillah, which is fascinating. I've never heard of somebody doing that before, but clearly, I mean, halachically, there seems to be no protest to such an idea. But I found that very unusual. And I was speaking to another Rav today on just completely unrelated, and he told me that he doesn't really like it. He doesn't like that idea of switching one to the other. For him, that's a very b'diavad. So ask your rabbi. I'm not going to protest against women's Megillah readings. Of course, if your Rav says it's okay, do that. You can totally do it. And it's probably much more of a culture by culture, community by community thing. And fundamentally, it boils down to how a Rav wants to paskin and public policy. Is this a good thing for this community or not? Especially when it comes to women reading. For women, it's and women reading for men, it's going to boil down to what is proper for that community. Let's move on. Purim and Carnival. Now, this is where the historians have some fun. If you talk to any knowledgeable guy and you mention the word Purim, he's going to say, oh, especially a knowledgeable, as a historian guy, he's going to tell you that Purim is like the Jewish Carnival, the Jewish carnival. And let me explain to all my Jewish listeners what that actually means, because many Jewish listeners don't know what that means. And my son came home from Torah Vodaas with a letter that they are having a Purim carnival. And of course, the word carnival is completely lost on the Rebbeim of Yeshiva Torah Vodaas. Let me give you a little bit of a history as to what carnival is. As you know, for the Jewish people, we have 40 days from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Yom Kippur. And Lahavdil Elef Alfi Avdalot, the Muslims have 40 days of Ramadan. And the Christians have the 40 days of Lent. And that is the 40 days before Easter for them. So in each religion, this is a time of penitence, a time of piety and repentance and self-examination and sacrifice. For the Christians, the 40 days that they spend in Lent is a time when they decide that they're going to make sacrifices, and we're going to refrain from eating meat and cheese, and they might fast and fatty foods, and they're going to do a lot of sacrifice. So before those 40 days, there developed this custom of Carnival, which was like a last hurrah before the days of fasting and the days of repentance came. And historians suspect that really this developed because at the end of the winter, people's stockpiles of meat and cheese were getting used up anyway, and they had to eat it before it went bad. So they had to just hope that the spring harvest would bring them enough food. But there was this period of 4 to 6 weeks between eating up the last of the winter stores and the spring harvest, where everyone had to just hope that their grain reserves were enough. And fasting and having a lower diet was pretty much a good idea. So the Carnival was a great way to celebrate the ending of the winter and the time before the time before the Lent period, and people would make a tremendous amount of merriment in order to close out the winter with a bang, let's say. And that kind of led to this type of merriment where people would dress up in costumes and masquerade, and they would get drunk in the streets. And it was an entire religious affair. And that evolved, of course, in different branches of Christianity. Over the centuries, it evolved into different things in different countries. However, because Purim is roughly the same time of year, it has been said that the Purim as we know it today, especially wearing masks and getting drunk in the street, comes from the Jews of Italy who are copying Italian Carnival. Let's add nuance to this in order so that we define what part of this is true, what part of this is not true. First, let's start with this. In the Shulchan Aruch, it says, Mutar Lisa Yeshiva Purim, your person is allowed to marry a woman in Purim. And the Ramah comments here at the very end of Tafresh Sadi Zayin. He comments about this new minhag of people beginning to wear masks on Purim. In case you didn't know, this is only a 500 plus year old minhag. This is not an ancient minhag. So he says, that which people put on disguises, v'gever lovesh shemlat isha, the isha clay gever, that men dress like women or women dress like men. Eini super davar, this is not prohibited. They're only trying to be merry and show merriment. They're not doing it in order to be licentious. And also this halachic construct if they're wearing klayim derabanan. Some people say it's prohibited, but however, the custom is primarily like the first minhag. So too the people that grab from each other in play. It's not stealing. As long as they follow the regulations of the respected dignitaries of the community. Where does he get this from? The Purim Myths. In order to understand this halachic context, we have to know who Rabbi Yehuda Mintz was. Rabbi Yehuda Mintz is buried next to Don Yitzchak Abravanel in Italy. And Rabbi Yehuda Mintz was the Rav of Venice. I think he grew up in Padua, but he was the Rav of Venice. And he, in his Shailot and Shuvot, brings not from himself, but he brings from a much more distinct. He's somebody he calls like the Gadol Hadar, Rabbi Yakim Siegel, somebody that we've never heard of, but somebody he believes is a much greater Talmid Chacham than him. He says everything he says is Kiyetzim et Pia Gvura. Rabbi Yakim Siegel, he already was matir, and he was matir people to masquerade on Purim. And what's interesting is that this period when Rav Yehuda Mintz lived was before the ghetto culture in Italy, meaning he died in like 1508 and the ghettos didn't open until 1505. So what you need to understand about Jewish Italy at the time is that the Jews of Italy were still very integrated into Italian society. Yes, of course, there was tension because the Jewish population there was very successful merchants. But the Jews of Italy were embedded in the local culture. There's three major rules to religion, right? There's religion is always diverse, internally diverse, or a religion is always evolving, and a religion is always embedded in the local culture. Now, the Jews of Italy were forced by the dukes, especially the I think the Garaganza family. I don't remember the name exactly. They were forced by the ducal courts to participate in the Carnival. The Jews were forced to put on plays and make theater for the royal courts. They didn't have a way out of that. And what's interesting is that because that happened, the Jews also became the leading theorists of theater. And they became the pioneers of stage production and lighting techniques and masking techniques and costume effects. All of these early things from the late 1400s and the theater techniques of the early 1500s were pioneered by Jews in Italy. There was a Jewish playwright named Leon di Sommi. I didn't put a picture of his book. I'm sorry. I should have. I'll add the slides later. But Leon di Sommi wrote many plays, especially for the courts of the families of the dukes. And he also wrote the textbook, like the 16th century textbook on stage production, which till today, I mean, has had major effects. Like all of his theories of plot and plays and actors and drama, all of his theories. He was a professor emeritus at the University of Mantua. Like this all happened because the Goyim forced us to take part in their carnival. Now, in order to understand why this minhag spread to the Jews, you need to understand that the culture, it's not that the Jews were copying Italian culture. This was a shared culture, meaning if imagine today we have Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. I'm just showing two woodcuts here. One is a woodcut, one seems to be a copper engraving. And one you see that the Jews are all have masks, just like Carnival style, and the other you see there's no masks. You just see people at shul regular with making noises for merrymaking for Haman. But the Venetian, of course, the Venetian custom today is still to do an elaborate carnival, very much with those same masks as they used to do it back in the day. What I want to emphasize here is that the if you have today if you have today a Hafgana, right? You have a democratic country, and people do a protest in a democratic country. Is there anything religious about that? The answer is, of course, no. If in Israel, a democratic country, very religious people decide to do a Hafgana, are they copying protest culture from democratic countries and from the Goyim? Well, the answer is no. There's a shared culture here. We are citizens of a democratic country. We have a right to speak up and we want to peacefully make our voice heard. So therefore we protest. We hold up signs. We dress the way we do in the street. Sometimes they do road blockings, etc. This is a shared culture of protest. This is not something unique to religious people or irreligious people, right? So it would be silly if a historian in 400 years from now would tell you that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael copied Hafganot from the Goyim, right? That would be very silly. In the same way, to say that the Jews copied masquerading or copied masks from the Italian Carnival is very disingenuous because Jews were Italians. They were Italian citizens to a degree, and they weren't copying their neighbors. Carnival culture was the merriment culture of Italy. That was how, if you were going to have public merriment, people were going to be merry in public. They were going to be merry in the streets. That was how people dressed. They would put on masks. They would put on costumes. They would get drunk. They would make plays. And that was just how it was done in Italy. So Italy was, at the time, a cradle for culture for the entire Europe, both for Jews and for Goyim. The fact that Jews of Italy did this did have an effect on Jews elsewhere. And the culture of masking on Purim does come from the Jews masking in Italy, but it's not because they copied it from the Italian Catholic Carnival. It is because, and today, I guess, again, Carnival is mostly practiced by Catholics. Rather, it's because they shared a culture with their Italian neighbors, and that was their form of merriment. So I don't want to say that rather than debunking this myth, I just want to say that I want to clarify that there was a shared cultural context and they had a shared culture rather than one demographic copying or stealing or borrowing from another demographic. Okay, I hope I got that point across. Jews are not copying the Christian Carnival. That's not what Purim is. Yes, our masks come from Italy. Yes, they are similar to Roman Carnival. No, it is not a borrowing or a stealing. Number 4, the Purim spiel. This comes from the same cradle of civilization. This does come from Italy. Yes, it does come from originally the Jews of Italy and Germany pioneered this idea of doing a play. The myth here that I want to dispel, or not dispel or elaborate on, is that it's not a yeshiva thing. I meet a lot of people who think that a Purim spiel is a Hasidish thing, that it's a yeshiva thing. The answer is no. No, 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 no. If you look in the Jewish Encyclopedia, you'll find that they have names of plays going all the way back to the early 1500s in Ashkenaz. These German plays that were written, the Achashverosh spiel. They were writing plays for Purim for sure in the early 1500s. They were writing plays for sure even before that. The Jews, of course, as I just mentioned, were pioneers of Italian culture and really worldwide European culture. Yet, for some reason, there's this, notion that a Purim spiel is specifically a Hasidic thing or specifically an Ashkenazi or a yeshivish thing, but it's not. It is very much a Jewish thing. It's a Jewish thing that was born 500 or 600 years ago. It is our own genre. And the first one, honestly, the first one that we have that's published is from 1708, I think. It was published, the actual text of the play was published in 1708, at least according to the Jewish Encyclopedia. And because, of course, we were the pioneers of theater, we were quite good at making these kinds of plays. And some of them survive, some of them are funny, some of them are not. With some of these plays, you have the humor has gotten a little dry over the past 100 years. But if you'd like to look it up, there are many in Yiddish, there are a few in Hebrew, and it is worth. It's definitely a fun area of study. If anyone's bored tomorrow, Taanit Esther, I'd recommend looking up some old Yiddish Purim plays and Hebrew Purim plays, it might be interesting to you. One of the most interesting ones actually pertains to the Hamantaschen and Haman's non-existent hat. This is myth number 5. This one we could actually debunk because it doesn't actually deserve any it doesn't really deserve any respect, to be fully honest. This is another one of those dreidel myths, something our Moras made up. And yes, it's beautiful that so many of us still have the Amunah Pshuta of our youth, that we still believe everything our Moras told us. But we do have to move on from elementary school. And no, Haman did not have a hat, nor was it a three-cornered hat. There is no source for this. It was written in Hebrew in a book in the 1900s. Yes, somebody did write this conjecture down in a book in the 1900s, but unfortunately, no, there was no Haman's three-cornered hat. This is a myth. But the Hamantaschen, of course, and the Oznei Haman, that really does go back, meaning having a three-cornered pastry called a Hamantash or Oznei Haman does really go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. That's not a fake minhag, meaning eating Hamantaschen is not a fake minhag. There was an Italian minhag to eat a pastry like a I should say like I think it was a three-cornered oily fried pastry that might have been similar. They used to call it Oznei Haman, or the ears of Haman. It was probably based off of a fake medrash, which claimed that Haman's ears were cut off before he was hanged, which was common in medieval times. People would hang, when people were getting executed, sometimes their ears would be cut off. But there were also other pastries that were made for the fingers of Haman and the eyes of Haman, right? The Moroccans are very into stabbing the eye of Haman. But Hamantaschen, as you know it today, right, is really from a play on words. In German, there was something called Muntaschen, which is poppy seed pastries. A Muntash is just that, a poppy seed pastry. And I'm sure they were delicious. They were three-cornered, and they were distributed for Purim. Exactly for what reason? Probably because it rhymed with Haman. Haman, Muntaschen, Hamantaschen, same idea. Finally, I think it was Eliezer ben Yehuda in Eretz Yisrael, who was like one of those pioneers of the Hebrew language to be a spoken language. He called poppy seed pastries, which are Hamantaschen, Oznei Haman, which is kind of not the correct usage. But that also, I believe, came from a play from Leon de Somi. Leon de Somi actually has a play from the 1500s where he mentions Oznei Haman. And because he was familiar with that play, which was actually written in Hebrew and not in Italian, therefore he decided to call these Hamantaschen Oznei Haman. So until today, the Israelis call the Hamantaschen Oznei Haman. So yet again, we have Italy affecting our culture of Purim till today. We have the plays, we have the masking, and we even have the name of Oznei Haman. All three of those come from Venetian Italy from the early 1500s or maybe the late 1400s, which is I believe is personally I think is very interesting. Somehow Italy got lucky and managed to mold the culture of Purim for the next 500 years. Lastly, the half one. This is something somebody texted me today, and it's not really a myth. It's just something I thought 5.5 Purim myths would be funny, so that's what I did. Sorry if that's nerdy. Essentially, somebody texted me today. Do you say Purim Shushan or Shushan Purim? And it took me a few seconds to understand what he was saying, because I thought I knew what he was saying, but then I had to Google it to really understand. Essentially, one half of the Rishonim say Shushan Purim. The other half of the Rishonim say Purim Shushan. And he thought that essentially the Ashkenazim were saying Shushan Purim, and the Sfaradim were saying Purim Shushan. The truth is that neither of them are grammatically correct. Saying Shushan Purim just doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't say Haman Oznayim, right? You wouldn't say that. You wouldn't say the Haman of ears. Same thing. That's just not how Hebrew works. You would say Purim Shel Shushan or Purim de Mukafin, right? The Purim of the walled cities, correct? That's just how it is. You would never say that's just Hebrew. Purim Shel Shushan, Purim de Mukafin, Purim de Shushan. Why do we call it Shushan Purim? Or, why don't we call it Purim Shushan or Purim de Shushan? The answer is we don't know. In the Hebrew Academy of the Hebrew language, they have this article where they claim that it's probably because in Yiddish or Ladino, they called it something similar, which sounded like the construction over there would have been Shushan Purim rather than Purim Shushan. And they believe that because of the influence of Ladino and of Yiddish, where the construction is backwards, that's why today people call it Shushan Purim. But it's just fun. You could say Sameach Purim, Purim Sameach, whatever you want. But I thought this was funny. If I never stopped to think to myself that Shushan Purim was a funny way of characterizing these words. Also, on the internet, people were joking about Shalach Manas and Shalosh Sudis being written by the same guy. You know, whoever did like Shalosh Sudis and Shalach Manas were like the Queen Esther's Persian daughters, or whoever invented those words, Shalach Manas and Shalosh Sudis. Those are the same people. For some reason, we just have some funny ways of naming things when it comes to Purim time. Anyway, with that, we finish our 5.5 Purim myths. I appreciate everyone's time and attention and tuning in. Bezrat Hashem, next week, the next time we will join, we'll finish off the tefillah. I think we have really just the end left, perhaps Aleinu L'Shabeach, which is a very fascinating history. And then, Bezrat Hashem, we will be done tefillat shachrit. So thank you to everybody for your time and attention. If anybody has any questions, input, make sure to comment or send me an email, and we will continue Bezrat Hashem next week.